If anybody would like to utilize the chat right now to say where you're joining us from, I would love to read out some of the many places that we have people coming from. So right in the chat, we have Michelle from Tel Aviv. Welcome, Michelle, Tel Aviv. Good, we're Tribe Tel Aviv, so we want to have lots of the link to the Facebook Live. I'm going to share it with you because we just went live now. So just give me one moment and I'll share it. I'm going to copy the link into our Zoom so that everybody can see it. Rosh Ha'ayin, Oded, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Roma, Maor, you're in Italy. Barbara and John from Northern California. Barbara, thanks for joining us. This is very exciting. Brianna from Beersheba, welcome. All right, and we have Reuven from Jerusalem, also very exciting. So I am about to kick off and share what we are going to talk about today. Now, we have Noor Awad. He is a community activist and he is a tour guide. I actually have friends who have been on his tours, and they say that he's an energetic, fun tour guide who does not ignore. He is very inclusive and explains all different sides of the conflict. But before we get into the conflict, we're going to ask Noor all about his experience growing up, what his culture is about. We don't want to jump too quickly into anything conflict related because we just really want to have a mutual understanding of what the Palestinian community looks like. Noor is involved with Roots Sharashim. It's a unique grassroots network of local Palestinians and Israelis who have come to see each other as partners. The work is aimed at challenging the new assumptions of these two communities that each has about the other, building trust, and creating new discourse around conflict in their respective societies. He organizes joint Palestinian-Israeli activities and speaks to visiting groups about his personal experiences living through the conflict as a Palestinian. Noor's family moved from Amman, Jordan, to Beit Sahor following the signing of the Oslo Accords. In 2014, Noor was licensed by the Palestinian Ministry of Tourism. He resides in Bethlehem today, where he guides English speakers on geopolitical tours of the region. And that's very exciting to be backed by the Palestinian Authority, Noor. So that's very exciting. Noor, why don't you come on and give us a little bit of an overview of who you are. Tell us how many brothers and sisters you have, what your move was like. Get us kicked off on the story of your life.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Noor. I live in Bethlehem, and I hope that this conversation we will have will be like a good one. I will talk a little bit about my background, my personal story, and then I will be interested to hear your questions. I hope that I can answer your questions about the situation, about my society, and also anything related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm 30 years old, almost. Actually, I'm 29 and a half. In June, I'll be 30 years old. And I was born in Amman in Jordan for a Palestinian family. Both of my parents lived there for a while. My story, of course, goes back before that. I mean, in a way, my story starts somehow in 1948. Because my family back then in 1948, they didn't live in what we call today the West Bank. They didn't live in Bethlehem. My family on both sides are originally from the Jerusalem area. And they used to live in southwest of Jerusalem in a small village. Today, one of the areas or the neighborhoods of Jerusalem, Malha. So my grandparents came from Malha. And in 1948, during the Israeli-Arab War, they found themselves on the front lines of the battles of the war, and their village was a very dangerous place for them to stay there. So my grandparents had to leave their village. So that's how it's connected to 1948. They end up in a refugee camp. My parents were born in Bethlehem, and today I live in Bethlehem. Both of my parents are here. I have 4 siblings, 3 brothers and 1 sister. My younger brothers are in university. They are in the university here in Bethlehem and in Hebron. My second brother is married and he have a kid now. My sister is also, she's in the second year now in university in Hebron University. She's studying interior decoration. And both of my brothers are now trying to, get out for for the working field, trying to get decent jobs, improve their lives, move on with their building a future. This year actually, has been very difficult. It interrupted everyone's, plans. I work as a tour guide. I worked as a tour guide mostly until last March when the pandemic started. And like most of tour guides in Israel and Palestine, we lost, our job. But I had also the opportunity to do some virtual tours on Zoom and to speak to groups. Sometimes groups that basically want to have a tour or want to have a discussion on a certain issue. So this is where I am today in general, and I'll go now more in details on my personal story and how it affected how I grew up and how it affected me and where I am today. So as I started saying, I wasn't born here. I was born in Jordan in 1991. And I mentioned already that my family goes back to Jerusalem from 1948. And that's very important in how my story actually developed later. My grandparents, as I said, had to leave their village in 1948. Their village was taken and became on the Israeli side. My family ended up in a refugee camp in Bethlehem area. They thought at the beginning this will be a short time, and then they will go back to their village, but that didn't happen. The last ceasefire agreement between Jordan and Israel in 1949 basically established a ceasefire line. So west of that line, now that's Israel, that's the state of Israel, and east of it, it's the Jordanian ruled West Bank. So my family ended up staying in a refugee camp here in the West Bank, in Bethlehem area. And their village on the other side of that line where they are not allowed to go back to it. My grandfather didn't want to stay in a refugee camp. So he left the refugee camp. He took his kids, my uncles, he took his, my grandmother, and they left the refugee camp and they moved to a house in the little town of Bethlehem. And since then, my family still live at the same house. My grandparents lived in that house. My parents are actually still living in the same house from 1951. Now, both of my parents were born here in Bethlehem. My mother actually, she was trained to become a nurse in 1980s, in 1986, 87. And that was the years when another chapter of the conflict, the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising started. And she was a nurse in a hospital in East Jerusalem. My father, on the other hand, he didn't want to stay in the country. He saw that he basically didn't see if there is a future for him to stay here. And it was very common at that time that young people from my society, from my people here, would tend to leave the country, to go to different places, different countries, find a better life and a better future for them. So my father wanted to actually go to Europe. And on the way, he stopped in Amman for a while. But then he ended up staying there. And my mother actually went to Jordan. They got married. And that's how I was born here. In 1995, the Oslo peace process, that was already signed, and now we are 2 years in the process. My family felt very optimistic, very, I can say, hopeful, because it's the first time in their lives, I mean, in my parents' lives, they hear instead of wars and occupation and conflicts, now there's a peace agreement. And everyone is talking about, what the future, the soon future will be. The occupation will end, and soon there will be a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And so both of my parents felt very, actually, as I said, very optimistic to come back and to reestablish a life for us here. Now, my parents could actually move back from Jordan because they were born in the West Bank. They were born here. So that's how we moved back from Jordan in 1995 to Bethlehem in the West Bank. We lived in Beit Sahor, a small town next to Bethlehem. And let me say that the way how I remember, when I was like 7 years old, an 8 years old kid in the mid of 1990s, the way how I remember things, I didn't remember so much of the conflict. I don't remember so much of the occupation. Not because it wasn't there, but because it was a different time. I remember mostly that my father, was working in Jerusalem, and he used to go to his work easily. Sometimes he could actually drive his car from Bethlehem to his work in Jerusalem, and sometimes he took me with him. As a family, at the weekend, sometimes we might also go to the beach. We go to Yafa, Tel Aviv, we go travel, like we go to the north, we go around the country. So I experienced movement, or the way how I moved around. I didn't really felt it's like I didn't felt like the conflict. It was a normal life, a normal situation for me. But soon that changed. I mean, the year 2000 came, the peace process came to a dead end, and it created like a very complicated situation on the ground. It got stuck in the middle without like a solution. And violence started, and it led to the second Palestinian uprising, the second Palestinian intifada. That was a very violent time, and I'm sure it affected everyone in this country. But if I want to talk about the effect of the intifada on me personally and also my generation, I'll say that all of a sudden now I'm like living the reality. I'm living what's happening here, and I'm trying to adapt to this new reality. My family was involved in the second intifada in a way or another. Some of my cousins were part of the security members of the Palestinian Authority. Some of them were members of the militant movements or the political movements like Fatah and Hamas and the Tanzim and others. And not only that, at some point the city of Bethlehem was invaded by the Israeli military. So there was no schools for a couple of weeks and months. Curfews outside. It was dangerous to go outside. We hear in the news the bomb suiciding attacks also in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv and different places. And so this is the new reality that I'm talking about, the reality of a conflict. And at the same time, I start to learn more about myself, who I am, living here. What does it mean to be a Palestinian? Why I'm living in this situation? Why I'm finding myself in this situation. And so the years of the Intifada affected a lot the way how I grew up, my experience, when it comes also to the question of a national identity, a national struggle, all of that. And by the end of the Intifada, I can say that I struggled with like two ideas. So basically the Intifada ended, and I start to think, I look around and I realize that I'm living an abnormal situation here. So when I look at that, and we are in the age of the internet. So when I look like around me, and I see that other people in the world, they might be living different situation, war situations, but many other people in the world don't live the same situation that I do here. So why is that? And how can I have a normal life? Or the question actually was for me, will I ever have a normal life here in Palestine in this situation? And the answer back then for me was, it seems like not. I'm not going to have a normal life as long as I'm living here. So I start to think in a way similar to what my father thought in the 80s, which that I cannot have a normal life here. So therefore I will just run away, choose a different country, choose a different place where I can have a better future and a stable life. So that's one way of thinking. And it's not only me thinking this way. I think I do represent a good amount of my generation thinking this way. I already see that there are like several questions in the
Yes, we're
chat.
gonna take the questions at the end. The questions
So,
from the
yeah.
audience, we're gonna save time for the end. We do want to get into the your experience politically, but before we do that, I would like for you to share a little bit with us about what is Palestinian society like in the West Bank? What are some cultural things that might surprise Jews? What are some traditions? What is life like on a day to day? Could you paint us a little bit of what your family dynamic is like, your neighborhood dynamic for us, so that we don't know what life is like in the West Bank for non-Jews. So if you could share some of that before we get political, that would be excellent.
Yes, sure. I mean, like one of the first ideas that comes to my mind, I think that many Jews, Israelis, and maybe non-Israelis, they see the Palestinian society um, as like, mostly when I hear like the Israeli news, when I read the Israeli news, they refer to Palestinian cities sometimes like villages. They refer to the Palestinian society as a village society or as a tribal society. And they still see that the Palestinian society is still in large a tribal society, which means that the loyalty of the individual is to the tribe, to the larger family, which is to a certain extent, I can say it's true, but it's not really showing the whole picture. It's not showing, the reality, because at the same time there is this and that. Yes, there is like the powerful connections of the family, but not all families are today like large, and not all families, are part of the tribes, and not all families actually are, exercising this old tradition of being a part of a tribe. I can even say there is a difference between south and north of the West Bank. And here, south would mean from Jerusalem and southward, like until Hebron, where you can feel that the old tradition, the traditions concerning tribes and families, are still much more like people are still holding on it much more than in the north, in cities like Nablus, Shechem, or in Jenin, where these kind of connections, tribal and large family connections, doesn't really exist that much anymore. For example, like if you go to a city like Ramallah, where it is actually a concept of a city, because in Bethlehem is a small city where like almost everyone knows everyone, and like these families and people. But in Ramallah, you have a mix of people coming from outside of Ramallah. Many people actually in Ramallah are from outside. They're coming from outside of Ramallah, and that's for example one idea that I think that Israeli Jews and Jews maybe don't really see in the Palestinian society, but they still see the classic picture of an Arab tribal society. But they don't really see the developments or the changes inside the Palestinian society today.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Can you tell us a little bit about the family structure, whether religious, secular, education? What can we imagine the family dynamics to be like? Are there all different types of Palestinians throughout the religious sector? Is that respected? Is that to be hidden if you're not observant or observant? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to understand this topic, terminology is important here, but at the same time, when we talk about, like religious and conservative, and sometimes this terminology is not exactly describing the situation. So I'll try to describe it as best as I can. I think that the largest part of my society is traditionally conservative. I can say 60% of the people are traditional and conservative and religious to a certain extent, meaning that religion for them is part of the tradition. It's part of what they inherited from their parents and from grandparents' generation, and they follow it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that. So you would see that like people are not like too religious. And actually, if you talk to someone, to an average Palestinian who practice or like keep certain amount of like religion, and if you tell this guy or this woman, or if you tell them that you are religious, you are like being religious, they usually say no, they are not really. They don't see themselves as religious people, but they are like keeping certain like amount of the religion. They are following it. So I would mostly, the way how I describe the society is traditional conservative. That's what I would like maybe to, that's how I can like describe the society.
What are
And
some of the traditions or religious things that come up on a day-to-day that we can learn about from Palestinian society?
um, I mean, there are always like um, issues like of, you know, social issues like um, when it comes to, for example, like family issues, like relationship between a man and a woman, the relationship between like the parents and their children. Um, these like discussions that's, you know, that happens. For example, um, I'm not sure of what if can you like give me an example of what
Sure. So
like to
for
understand what you are, yeah, asking me.
sure, for example, we could say that before eating bread, Jews wash their hands with water 3 times on the right, 3 times on the left. That's a
Mhm.
tradition that
Yeah,
most Jews know about. Or,
yeah.
can you give us some of the religious or traditions that you might do, a Palestinian might do on a day-to-day basis, something like that?
So that's exact. So okay, thank you. So that's actually something to clarify what I was talking about before. So in the Muslim tradition and in Islam, for example, there would be a saying like a prayer that you usually say before you eat a meal, before you have a meal, right? But most people don't really follow this tradition, except in certain like holidays, for example, or occasions, like in Ramadan. People would tend to do these things, but for the rest of the year, people don't necessarily do it, and that's what I meant by when I described the way how people practice religion. They are not necessarily like they are not you know strictly religious and follow every single rule, but they keep it as a tradition in general. And there are times in the year where people follow these types of tradition, like for example, saying this prayer. Um, Also, you mentioned before, like I was trying to describe how this is like the society makeup. So I say this is in my opinion that 60% of my society would fall into the category of like traditional conservative religious. That's how I see them. And then the 40% would fall into a category of, I will call it like uh, modern liberal, trying to be free from all the traditions. That's how I can like see and there is like levels to how liberal they are, how modern they are, because there are like also subgroups in this community, like in this like second part. Um, yeah, that's
Okay. So is nothing that you would say is specifically Palestinian in terms of traditions. Whatever goes in Islam, if you're practicing, you do it, and if you're not practicing, you don't do it. Or would you say that there is any something special that the Palestinian group of people do traditionally that might be different from any other Arab group around the world?
No, of course, there are things that Palestinians would do that will be different from other Arab countries. When you come to the food, for example, or dressing, or if you go to the like more these details, like you will always find like different details from like other Arab like nations. And like each area, for example, like if we are talking about, let's say we are talking about like the traditional dresses, for example, like the women dresses in the old times, Of course, it's hard to see anyone now like wearing these dresses, except in weddings or in engagement parties. Sometimes the girl would choose to actually wear like these old traditional clothes or dresses. So these dresses, for example, was specific to each area. You can actually say where this woman or this young lady is from just looking at her dress and the embroidery at her dress. That's like very famous on the Palestinian culture, for example. Like Bethlehem here was very famous with and still with a traditional dress where women actually used to have a hat on top of it with certain like decoration and a scarf that coming down from it, and it used to be everyone, you know, wearing it. All women, Christian, Muslim women, they used to wear the same dress. So you could actually say that this woman is from Bethlehem because she's wearing the Bethlehem dress. But that was like long time ago. As I said, like mostly today, people don't wear these dresses except in the in occasions. When it comes to music, there is a distinct Palestinian music. There is the Palestinian flute, or like the shababa, we call it in Arabic, which is like a two-pipe flute, and it has like there is a certain melody, usually, that's connected to the Palestinian identity. And the one who usually plays the flute used to be a shepherd outside with his, you know, cattle, herding his sheep, and that's the picture of it. And then, of course, later with like within the national conflict, that picture became like part of the like showing Palestinian identity, showing, you know, Palestinian culture. Some of these like old songs were made into like national ones using the same instrument and using the melodies from that instrument. So there are specific, yeah, if you go to details, then there are specific things that differentiate it from other Arab countries.
That was so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that and drawing those images for us in our minds about the flute and the music and the dress. It's I think questions that a lot of Israelis have because they don't have an opportunity to meet with or understand the culture of the people that live right next door, literally. So that's very beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Now, what I want to understand is what is the main concern for Palestinians today? Would you say that the political sphere is dominated with questions of conflict regarding Israel, with internal Palestinian conflicts and politics, or would you say that the average person is concerned with their day-to-day life, earning a living, making their way to work, providing for their family? Because I think that from an outside perspective, each group thinks of the other, that all the other group is doing all day is thinking about the conflict. Is that correct?
I can say that yes, like most people here in my society are not really thinking every day about the conflict and about like the whole, you know, the conflict situation and what's happening, but more about like their daily life. In both the positive side of it and the negative side of it. That's my personal opinion I'm sharing with you here. And I mean by both positive and negative. So the positive side is that despite the challenges and despite the abnormal situation that I tried to explain before in my personal story, people are trying to live their life, trying to move on, trying to find, you know, success. So that's and I see like live examples of this every day. This is like most people are trying to improve their lives, to make sure that they to have a better job, to have a better income, and to make sure that their kids in the future will have like a better opportunities. That's where most people are focusing on. The negative side of focusing on day-to-day issues, in my point of view, is also the lack of focusing on important issues regarding the conflict or regarding the Palestinian situation that will affect our future as a nation. It will affect us together. For example, the question of basically the question of citizenship. as living under the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority is not a state, and at the same, it's this self-autonomy. It's like it's governing us. And the question of democracy, the question of how do we choose our leaders, the question of the division between Fatah movement and Hamas, and the question of elections. For 16 years there's no elections, but at the same time, people don't really feel that these elections are going to really to change anything if it happens. So people stopped. I think, in my opinion, people stopped thinking about these questions and trying to take decisions and to improve their understanding of the larger picture by focusing on their life, day-to-day life, and personal issues. So that's how I see it. And this is, I think, if I want to go further into an analysis, which is like, maybe many Palestinians wouldn't share this, wouldn't admit it, but I think it's part of a victimhood mentality, of a victimhood narrative that we have and we believe in, and we have been practicing for a long time, because we are victims at the end of the day of this conflict, and we live under the occupation. So, but this victimhood mentality reached to a place where people sometimes are unable to take responsibility to determine their future when they have a chance to. Many people, for example, would argue that the elections on the Palestinian Authority side has no meaning at all, because at the end of the day, the one who controls the the situation is the Israeli military and the Israeli government. So from this point of view, that we cannot really change anything, or we cannot affect the situation. And I think this is like a victimhood mentality, even though there's a good point to talk about, like here, and like how basically life, how life is functioning, and the dynamic of life, and how the occupation is affecting us. But we still have a role to play as a civil society, and that's many people in my society don't really, I think, understand or agree on.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very important to think about, and definitely, if you're someone who wants to mobilize, it may be a little frustrating. As a Palestinian who moved from Jordan to the West Bank, do you feel that you view the Palestinians as one of these people, both of these people, culturally, politically, and how do Jordanian Palestinians view themselves and their own identity?
So the basic understanding of our national identity is that we are all the same people. We are all connected to this land. This is our homeland. We don't feel like our connection to Jordan is not connection to a homeland, or it's not connection to a land, as much as it's part of this, it's another Arab nation. We have a long history that goes back together, and many people have just the simple idea that these borders between us, these were borders that drawn by Westerners, by the French and the British, by the colonial powers. So in the old times, there was no borders, and the Palestinians and the Jordanians have a very special relationship that goes back in the history. Even like families, like marriage and like intermarriage, and families moving on one side or the other. That's how most Palestinians like see the relationship with Jordan. But when it comes to the national identity, our relationship to Jordan was not all the time beautiful. It was not all the time good. It had also negative impact on us. Now, I, for example, wouldn't call myself a Jordanian Palestinian or a Palestinian Jordanian, even though I was born in Jordan. I lived there for 5 years. I have a birth certificate that I was, born there, of course. But for example, I cannot become a Jordanian citizen. I cannot carry a Jordanian passport. If I want to get a Jordanian passport, there is a special category for Palestinians like me who will get something called a temporary Jordanian passport, which is, I will never get, like, there is no legal way to get citizenship in Jordan. And at the same time, I don't want that. And I think most of the Palestinians, the majority of Palestinians, don't want to get Jordanian citizenship. I'm speaking about people in my case, for example, because I think there is like it gets mixed here for Israelis and for Jews. How many Palestinians there are in Jordan? And I always hear the claim that 70% of Jordan population are Palestinians. And I didn't really understood where that came from, how people do talk about like which figure, because if we are talking about the Palestinians in Jordan, according to the United Nations from 1948, and according to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization that registered all Palestinians since it was established in the 60s until now. So there is today 3 million Palestinians in Jordan. And Jordan population is 10 million. So we make up to 30% of Jordan population. Some of us, a minority has Jordanian citizenship. They managed to get a Jordanian citizenship between the years of 1948 and 1967, and a little bit in the 70s after 1967. But most of Palestinians are still stuck there with a refugee status and refugee camps, and they have no way to get a Jordanian citizenship. And most of them, they don't want a Jordanian citizenship because they are afraid if they get a Jordanian citizenship, they will lose their right to their homeland, to Palestine. So that's how it is. And when I mentioned, for example, like these numbers, I do understand that, like, for example, sometimes people might take what I just said, that, you know, in the old times before borders, you know, there are families that moved, and like people who got married here on this side or the other side. And so who's really a Jordanian, who's really a Palestinian? But, you know, before the borders, you know, the entire region was like this. People moved from Lebanon or moved from Syria or Iraq, and that doesn't make them today less Palestinians or more Jordanian or vice versa. So that's how I see it. And if in my society, I am not looked at as a Palestinian Jordanian or Jordanian Palestinian. That's not how my society sees me. If I want to describe how the society sees me, they will see me as Palestinian, who's a descendant of a refugee from 1948. Because not at the end of the day, not all Palestinians, most of Palestinians have their ancestors in 1948 had to move, but not all Palestinians. For example, like in Bethlehem, some or most of my friends, I can say, they don't have, their ancestors had lived in Bethlehem in 1948. They weren't really affected by like, you know, the moving. And so their grandparents are not refugees like my grandparents. So that's how people will, for example, like distinct me in a way, saying that I'm a Palestinian who has a refugee background.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing that. You did touch a little bit on this before, but I want to finish off with my questions before we open up to the crowd, asking what would you say is the most common political outlook in the West Bank from Palestinians? Do Palestinians in Area A feel that they have some form of self-governance? And what do you see as the future of the Palestinian state, including Gaza? Do you foresee unity between Gaza and the West Bank? What's that common thought?
So to answer, you know, the first part of the question, the first question is, I think that to a certain extent, I can say yes. Like Palestinians feel that they have, you know, since the Palestinian Authority was established, we are under the Palestinian Authority. Yes, technically, at the same time, we are under the Israeli military control. We are under the Israeli military law and the Israeli occupation and all of that. But we are also at the same time under a Palestinian Authority, and Palestinian Authority decisions affect us directly, and so that's how it is. But today, most of the young generation and most of the people, I can say, don't feel that we have any sovereignty over the land when it comes to who's sovereign. At the end of the day, you know, Israeli military enters Area A. Palestinian security forces, at the same time, are limited in where they can, you know, where they can operate. And just this simple fact shows every Palestinian that we have no sovereignty. And that's how most Palestinians think about the question of, I think that's how most Palestinians think about like the issue of sovereignty and how like the controlling of the West Bank and Area A especially. Also, there was, you know, if we talk about like the areas, Area A, B, and C, these like in a way, like people don't take the different areas as borders. I mean, there was supposed to be a two-state solution, and there was supposed to be a Palestinian state, and the Palestinian state should be on most of the West Bank. But like because two-state solution never happened, and we have no control over Area C, and so people are like seeing like the effect of the occupation more than there is like really a control for Palestinian Authority. I'll be saying something that maybe will maybe piss off some Palestinians, but for example, we celebrate independence, which is on the 15th of November each year, and independence was like declared in 1988 by the PLO, by Yasser Arafat, when he was in Tunisia. But in reality, most of Palestinians find this like being the most funny holiday, because we are celebrating something that doesn't exist. It's like sarcastic. People take it in a very sarcastic way, that we celebrate independence, but we are not independent at the same time. Now, for the second question, the relationship with Gaza, people from outside have to understand this, that Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Gaza, we are the same people. There are families who are living here and families who are living there. There are husbands and wives on both sides. They are like all of kind of relationships. We are the same people. The problem is with a political division between political leaders and political powers. And here, this will be Fatah movement and Hamas, and the question of the Palestinian Authority and the elections. So recently, just this in the past 2 days, there had been like a serious development on this topic, where Hamas finally agreed to conduct elections in Gaza and the West Bank. And so now the elections commission or committee will choose like a date. It will be mostly next May 2021. We'll see yet. It's not yet official, but it seems that there are going to be elections finally. And the elections will basically means that there is unity on the political level officially now between Gaza and the West Bank, if that happened. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the physical disconnection. There is an entire generation that grew up here, never made it to Gaza. I was never in my life in Gaza. I can't go there as a Palestinian from the West Bank. And all of Gazans, most of Gazans, 99.9% of them can't also come to the West Bank. The only way that they get outside, some Gazans get outside of Gaza, is that when they have a chance to be treated in a hospital in East Jerusalem. And so that's how they make it to East Jerusalem and to the West Bank. I hope, I'm not sure if I hope that this last talk about elections will be serious, and I hope it will lead to a democratic process. I'm basing my hope because the Palestinian Authority is also in front of a challenge. Palestinian leadership for a long time was divided, and it must understand that this division is actually destroying our situation. It's impacting our situation in a very bad way. So we have to conduct these elections. We have to come together, and we have to accept the result of the elections. And I hope that it will be a smooth democratic process.
Excellent. We hope so as well. I would like to open the floor to questions. Now, I want you to keep in mind that we have a lot of questions to get to. So if you can try to keep your answer to each one, I would say about a minute or two so that we can get through all of them. That would be excellent, because I do want everyone to get their question answered. I am going to start right from the top in our Zoom, and then I will get to the questions that we also have on Facebook Live. So we have a lot of people viewing right now. From Joseph Flashner. How do you feel about the fact that Jordan, whose majority is Palestinian, although you squashed that myth before and let us know that 3 out of every 10 Jordanians are Palestinian? How do you feel that Palestinians are not treated equally as Jordanian citizens? What's your personal belief?
So I feel this is a form of discrimination against us as Palestinians, but I cannot at the same time ignore the fact that the vast majority of Palestinians in those refugee camps, and there are surveys and statistics about that, they are still basically showing that they are holding into their identity, and they don't want the relocation to be enforced on them, meaning that to get equal rights and to get citizenship, they have to forget about their homeland or their right of return. So that's how I see it.
Thank you. Next question. Do you feel that the Abraham Accords distance a future Palestinian-Israeli conflict? I assume that that Roni means puts a distance to a future Palestinian-Israeli resolution.
I think it again, the negative impact. I think I have a very unique opinion, or like a different opinion from the rest of the Palestinians, from the rest of my people.
Can you share?
In Yeah, so I'll say in general first that many Palestinians feel that this agreement basically was going, around the Palestinian issue, dropping responsibility because the Arabs are responsible at the end of the day toward the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian issue, and by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, going and signing this agreement, they are like dropping out. They are not really taking the responsibility toward the Palestinian people, and they are. Most Palestinians feel the sense of betrayal, that they got betrayed by Arabs when they do these such things. My personal opinion, the way how I see things, I think that we had for a long time we had been saying we boycott Israel, we shouldn't talk to Israel, we have to uh, like all of this kind of like boycotting behavior that actually led to nowhere. I do understand that there are many reasons why the Abraham Accords actually happened, and the feeling of the animosity or the threats by Iran, and maybe not necessarily because the people in the UAE all are convinced that we can make peace with Israel, but the government decided that, the regime decided that, and then people are just some are supportive, some are not. I hope that this will lead. Actually, I hope that it will create a chance. It will open another channel of dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis, and it will bring us closer to each other. I'm just concerned that when it comes to Israel, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had said clearly that he don't need the Palestinians to be the door for the Arab countries to go through them to normalize the ties or to create ties with Arab countries. But basically, he can go around the Palestinian issue and make ties with Arab countries. I hope that this will play in our favor, and he sees that actually you cannot act that the situation is normal, and you have to come back and solve the Palestinian issue.
Thank you. How do you feel about the settlers, Jewish settlers in the West Bank?
So how do I feel about them? It's actually very complicated for me personally because I am involved in a movement, in a project where I work with Israeli settlers. But to make it simple, the settlers I work with, my partners, are the ones who came to acknowledge and recognize the reality I live. They recognize the occupation and the injustice of the occupation on me and my people. And they recognize that I do, my national aspirations and my national rights as a Palestinian. And I do the same. So this is like, if I want to simplify roots, we are about practicing our identity without denying the other side identity, with finding recognition and empathy between us. We are still a very small group, of course, And the settlement movement is not that. The settlement movement is a movement that dedicated, in my point of view, to the destruction of any potential for a Palestinian state. As more as there are settlements in Judea and Samaria, more settlements in the West Bank, then there is no chance for a Palestinian state to be created. Or if this state was created, then it will not be a viable state. So it's the settlements and the settlers are a symptom of the conflict, and they are part of the occupation that I'm talking about.
Thank you. From Mike Roth. Hi, Noor. I would love to visit Ramallah and Bethlehem and other parts of Palestine in the West Bank. I would like to understand the Palestinian narrative better. I am a little bit nervous about my safety. What is a good way to feel comfortable and understand the risk of visiting these areas?
Thank you. I completely understand. You know, sometimes the barriers we have to face here in this country is not just the physical barriers. It's not just the checkpoint and the walls. It's also the fears we have inside us, and these fears exist for a reason. But you know, if you are afraid of something and you don't face it at some point, you will always be afraid, and you will always actually. I think that sometimes you'll even exaggerate in your fear. And I'm saying that as a tour guide who guided so many Israelis and so many Jews in the West Bank, in Area A, in cities like Ramallah and Bethlehem. So I would actually invite you to come to visit. It's better if you know someone who can actually show you around. And I would say that, like a technical advice, sometimes, you know, some things we do, some things we maybe we're, it's like misinterpreted. We have to understand the sensitivities of the conflict. I'll give example here. You know, the kufiya, the Palestinian scarf, is for me not just a scarf. It's also has like a political and national meaning. So when I put it on, I am basically sending a message. When I'm making a message, and so when I put it on and I go to an Israeli area, no matter which this area is, I think that people there might feel uncomfortable. Maybe they feel offended by that. So I wouldn't do that for the respect, you know, of the people there. And because I want that to have the experience of being there and learning and understanding the situation. So I will say, for example, the kippah, you know, that the men put on like on their heads, it's received here as not as a religious symbol. When you see someone with a kippah, we always remember Israeli settlers, and it reminds us, therefore, with the conflict. So I definitely would like recommend you to, you know, walk in the streets of Bethlehem and Ramallah, but don't like put a kippah on your head, or if you can wear a hat on top of it, that's better. Don't show any Jewish symbols, not because people are against the Jewish religion as religion, but because these symbols and emblems has also been connected to the conflict and has negative meanings for many people here, and it could be offending and sensitive. So other than that, you will be fine.
Thank you. A question from Hannah. Thank you so much for your wisdom and insight, Noor. How would you say the relations are between Christians and Muslims in the West Bank? Also, if you have time for this, do you believe that COVID has made an impact on the conflict?
Okay, the relationship between Christians and Muslims, it's a very big topic, I think. Listen, in general, I think if you ask any Palestinian, whether a Christian or a Muslim, the typical answer will be that the relationship is great, it's good. There is a lot of respect between the two groups, and there is like coexistence. Maybe that's the word that we use. Some other Palestinians don't like the word coexistence because it's not. We are not like two people who live, you know, two different people who live at the same place. We are the same people at the end of the day. We are all Palestinians. We feel that, and we are living, you know, in our country, whether as a Christians or as Muslims. But I have a critical also point of view. I think that in nature, because the Palestinian society is a traditional conservative one, relationships. So it's true that there is respect. It's true that, each side feel respected by the other side, but that doesn't mean that there are like problems of sometimes maybe racism. There are problems of maybe discrimination. Um I'm not sure. I can't say like when I talk about discrimination, I will not say that this discrimination is systematic. I'll not say that this discrimination you find it in the Palestinian Authority, but in the social structure, yes, still like there is the feeling among Christians that they are a minority when it comes to numbers, but that's a topic that we need to talk a lot about it. Like I'll just give a short example. If maybe some of you heard about like what happened in Jericho last week in a site called Nabi Musa. It's a shrine connected to Prophet Moses in Islam, and so there was a techno party that was like that happened there, that took place there in a religious place. Most of the society felt offended about it, but we also saw at the beginning a wave of accusation from some extreme, maybe I can say, or radical Palestinian Muslims toward the Christians, that they are responsible for the party and vice versa. But all of that is like I'm trying to say there are underlying issues that we need to talk about, racism and other issues like bullying, for example, that happens inside our society. But I like the typical Palestinian answer is that it's a great relationship, but I will say that it's a special relationship between Christians and Muslims here.
Thank you. Are you optimistic in the future of the Palestinian Authority? Do you anticipate political unity between Gazan residents, and should Israel be promoting that?
I'm not personally optimistic about the future of the Palestinian Authority because I see the challenges. At the same time, the level of corruption inside the Palestinian Authority, and that's an issue that we have been talking about for a long time. And corruption is not necessarily, I'm not referring only like financial corruption. It happens, corruption is in so many levels. For me, just the question basically, when a two-state solution failed, a two-state solution today doesn't seem like an applicable solution. So, and we have adopted that for the last 30 years as our national goal. This is what our national aspiration is, and this is what the Palestinian Authority is built on. So with the absence of a two-state solution, what is the identity of the Palestinian Authority? If Oslo peace process failed now after 25 years, so what the future of the Palestinian Authority? There are some serious questions about like the future of the Palestinian Authority, and for good reasons, most of the people I can say are not optimistic about that. Now, for the overall situation, to improve the situation, a unity between Gaza and the West Bank, meaning that to have a clear system, a system that basically Palestinian Authority that rules over the two, not the two places, the two areas, will be better for the overall situation if we are talking about establishing peace and peaceful relationships and coming to a like political solution. So I think that if Israel is like striving toward peace, striving toward a solution, it must facilitate and ease the process for Palestinians to find unity and to conduct elections in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem especially. Because last year when we had talks about like having elections in East Jerusalem, then the Israeli government said that they are not going to let Palestinians in East Jerusalem to elect, and that also created a problem on how the elections will be conducted.
Thank you. We're getting down toward the end. Do you know do you have any information from your ancestors if they had preferred to live under Ottoman rule? One of our listeners, Michelle, says that she heard from Christian Lebanese that it was very hard times, but perhaps that was because they were Christians and not Muslims. Do you have any recollection from your ancestors on that?
Sure. The discrimination during the Ottoman Empire time against non-Muslims, that was like at some point common, and it affected non-Muslims. But I can say the discrimination against non-Turks, non-Turkish people became also, for 200 years. That's a very, for example, that's one of the facts. For almost 200 years, Arabic literature and Arabic language wasn't taught in Ottoman schools. In Ottoman and Turkish schools especially, it was taught that the citizens of the Ottoman Empire are classified for several classes. The first important class of the society are the Turks themselves, and then after them there will be the Kurds, then after that the Arabs, and then after that the Jews. So those are like the levels of under the Ottoman Empire. So today, yes, we have maybe the feeling you hear from Palestinians that the Ottoman Empire was part of this 1,400 years of Muslim rule that ruled over this land. And back then, Jews were treated nicely comparing to Europe, or Christians were also treated nicely. But if you dig deep, you find that there is discrimination because of religion. And more than that, there was a discrimination because of ethnicity or of national identity. And that's a major reason why before the First World War, in the First World War, a movement of Arab nationalists was created, and the entire Arab national movement was created. So from my grandparents' time, I remember actually from my mother telling me these stories when I was young, of young Palestinian men who would be my great-grandfather now, my great-grandfathers. They were taken to wars. They were taken as soldiers to participate in the Ottoman army in wars for the Ottoman Empire, and that's how it affected the Palestinian. There's many writings about that, like in the 19th and the 18th century, about like the Ottoman rule in Palestine, how it looked like and how it affected the people here. So yes, of course, there was a discrimination, not just based on religion, but also based on ethnicity.
Such a long history for such a small people. Very interesting. Our final question is coming from Barbara Kraus. She said that earlier you were talking about two things that you struggled with. One was leaving, like your father, and then you didn't finish the second one. Perhaps we went into a different question. Do you remember what your other struggle was, and how can we get your tour services once travel is available again? So you can put your information into the chat for everybody who might want to find you when tours are ready.
Thank you, Barbara, for this question. It's actually, I was like trying to share with you like this chain of thoughts and this personal experience. And yes, I said like at some point I start to think that I have no future, no life here, there is no stability, and I should move somewhere else. And at the same time, I have the idea of that, but someone must take responsibility. If I'm leaving from here, and if my friends and people my age are leaving, so who would remain to actually change the situation? Who would remain to bring a better future, to make sure that there is a better future for the next generation? So as I'm growing up, I also start to have the sense, I start to feel the responsibility toward the situation, because I can blame the past generations. I can blame my grandparents. I can blame my parents, but that's their time and it's gone. And now it's our time. What can we do? And I put myself in front of this question, and I came to a conclusion that we must take responsibility. We cannot continue blaming others, and we must take responsibility. And those two ideas, I can say that many people in my generation, including myself, are struggling with. On one hand, you can say that you want to take responsibility. On the other hand, you are tired from this situation and you want to have a normal life and you want to have a break from all of this. You think about like moving. So it's a dilemma. That's how I describe it. But I'm still committed to being here and take responsibility and hope to bring a better future for all of us, for all of the people of this land, for both Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you. That was beautiful. We have a vote from someone in the audience who says that they hope that you run for political office. So you can take that as you like. Thank you very much, Noor. Was there any final thoughts or remarks that you wanted to make before I close out our session?
I just want to thank you for this opportunity. It's always very important for me to reach out to you guys, to talk to Israelis and to Jews in general, and to build more bridges of understanding between our people. And I also hope that in the near future, there will be also connections like these happening with like Israeli Jewish speakers speaking to Palestinian audience and learning more about the other side and building more bridges of understanding. So really thank you for this work.
You're welcome. It's very important for us as well. It's very important, even the small details of what a wedding dress might look like or what a flute might sound like is all of these little details help us understand our neighbors and help us create peace just by having all of these details and all of the pieces of the puzzle. So thank you so much. Question. Anyone who is interested in getting onto the Tribe Tel Aviv email list, please leave your email in the chat or send me a personal message and I will add you to the newsletter. We send out a newsletter so that we can help people find out about our events. I am Shanafold. I've been your host for this evening, as I am on all Monday evenings that we host the Sunset Series. So thank you for having me as your host. I put my contact information into the chat. I'm Shanafold. That's SHANNAFULD. I have 2 N's in my name. Don't forget it. So thanks again to everybody who came to participate in learning, in creating peace, in taking responsibility for what our current generation is working on. I think it's very important. We are running our Sons of Abraham series, which this was a part of. We are looking into different groups throughout Israel and territories who have a similar heritage to us, who have an ancestor who they call Abraham. So that's what our mini series has been about. I'm going to hang out here just for a moment while people might have some things to send in the chat, or if anybody would like to leave their email address. Thank you to everybody. And you'll be updated about who our next speaker is going to be once we have that finalized. So thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Thank you, Noor.
Thank you.